This is the assembly video to show you how to take two Maven S.2 spotting scopes and turn them into a set of big eyes using this setup from Adams Adapters. Now this adapter that you get from Adams Adapters is going to come with everything you see here. It's going to be this main base, two upper bases, 8 rings, 4 front rings, 4 back rings, this handle, the hardware it takes to put it together, and a shim kit for collimating it later on. The first thing you're going to want to do is assemble your handle to your main base. To do that, the front of the main base is where you see Adams Adapters. We're going to mount this handle to the back. So we use 2 1/4-inch bolts and no washers for this step, just the bolts. And we use the 2nd and the 3rd from the back hole to mount the handle. So drop your handle on there, tighten up these 2 screws. And when you're doing that, try to align this handle and get it fairly straight. There's some clearance in it, but you want it to be as straight as possible because later on you can use this hole as a sight when you're glassing to try to get you orientated to where you're actually looking. So get that as straight as you can. Snug those bolts down. And you should have a setup like that. Your handle should be protruding just off the back of that adapter, just a little bit. And again, it's on the back of the adapter plate opposite Adams Adapters. The next step is going to be mounting one of the spotting scopes to the upper base using 4 of the rings. The first thing we need to determine is which one is going to be the left scope and which one's going to be the right scope. Now, obviously, they're the exact same scope, so it doesn't matter which one you pick. But what we're going to do is we're not going to mount these conventionally. We're not going to use this adapter, this base. We're actually going to turn them 90 degrees so those bases are facing in. And the reason we do that is because with the bases facing in, those eyepieces get really close together. This objective is on a different center line than the eyepiece. So if you mount it conventionally, the objectives would hit and the eyepieces would be far apart. But if you just turn it 90 degrees, now it brings those eyepieces in close and it makes it a lot easier to see through. So we're going to call this the left scope, the base is facing to the right, and we're going to use the smaller rings, which are the rear rings, to clamp around the back side of this scope. So when you're picking them, the counterbore is going to be facing you. So as you're looking through your scopes, this counterbore is going to be facing you. So in this case, counterbore is facing you, this would be a left ring. Counterbore is facing you, this would be the right ring. The right rings have clearance holes for the bolts, and the left rings have the threaded holes. So these would go just like this. So this scope is going to be facing with this base to the right, so we're going to need to grab one of the right rings and lay it over the rear part of the scope. In doing that, what we're going to try to do is get this flat of the ring as parallel to this base as possible. That keeps the scopes from causing obstructions when you're trying to mount these. This protrusion would run into the other scope and it would keep you from getting your eyepieces close together. So what you're going to do is you're just going to eyeball that ring so it's as parallel to that base as possible. Then you just grab one of the left rings and wrap it around the scope. The first thing you can see is when you do that, these rings are actually compressing on this rubber. They don't have a loose fit. The reason we do that is because we want to make sure that this is a tight fit and that this scope is not going to move in the field. So there's actually a little bit of interference designed in. That's intentional. That's what you want. So again, eyeball it so it's parallel. Give yourself a little bit of clearance above the top of that base, but really close is fine. And then you're going to use 2 bolts to secure the rings together. Now, the bottom hole is going to take the longer of the 2 number 6 screws, and the top hole is going to take the shorter. So just drop those in there, and then all you're going to do is snug those. We don't want to tighten them because we want these rings to be able to move for the next step. So you can see the gap there, and if you tighten those up all the way, you can compress it and close that gap, but it wouldn't allow it to move and it would cause interference later on. So let's leave it loose for now, maybe a turn. Same with this one. Bottom it out, back it off maybe half a turn to a turn, and that way there's a little bit of play in those rings. So after you have the rear rings mounted up, the next step is to mount the upper base. Now these upper bases are mirror images of each other. There's a left base and there's a right base. You need to determine which base goes on this scope. The way you do that is you just match the jog of the scope. So this eyepiece is on the right side and the objective is on the left. So you need the upper base that does the same thing. So if I picked this upper base, this jogs to the right. If I mounted it, it would not match the objective down here. You can see it's not on center, so it would be the wrong base. You want the one that matches the jog of the scope. So this scope is jogging left, this base is jogging left, and that puts it on the center of the objective at the bottom. So that matches. And then you just secure that with 2 of the shorter number 6 screws. So you just drop those in there. And again, you don't want to tighten everything up at this step. We're just snugging it together just so it holds it together. But if you tighten it up, it's just going to fight when we're trying to mount it to the front rings. So I snug it and I back it off maybe a half a turn or so, quarter to a half a turn. Just enough so this base, as you can see, moves. Now we're ready to mount it to the front rings. Okay, now to mount the front rings, just turn the scope over. And the front rings have counterbores in them also. These counterbores should be facing up. So in this case, this would be a right ring. It would go on the right side of the assembly. Counterbore facing up. Just slide it over there. Then this would be counterbore facing up. This would make a left ring. And then this is why it's important that this setup is loose, because as you're trying to slide this over this rubber and compress it, because it's got this interference designed into it, it's hard to get everything to line up if it's tight. So if you can't get to the line up with these holes, just go back down here and loosen this up a little bit more. So all you're going to do is just slide that over. You're going to compress it a little bit with your fingers, and then you just drop in 2 of the shorter number 6 screws into the front here. And then while you're kind of squeezing it together, just tighten these bolts up. And again, if it doesn't quite go, you can maybe squeeze from the bottom or the sides just to get everything to kind of line up. And then you're going to bottom the screw out and then back it off again, just like we did before. So that's bottomed out. I'll back it off a little bit. Do the same thing here. Bottom this guy out and then back it off a little bit. And you'll also probably notice when you bottom this out that it actually moves these rings. It's going to make these rings perpendicular to this base. And what you're trying to do is get a good, consistent clearance in front of this ring here, all the way around. So move it with your fingers up and down while this is loose. And just kind of get this front ring an even distance in front of that gold ring in front of your focus knob. You're just trying to eyeball that so it's the same. Then we're going to drop a screw in each side here. So again, the longer screw goes in the bottom. It's longer number 6. And then the shorter number 6 goes on the top. Then snug those guys up. And then back it off half turn or so. Do the same thing on the bottom. And now you should have a setup that looks like this, but isn't tight yet. Once you get everything to where it looks like it's correct, it looks like it's perpendicular, there's a good clearance around the front of that ring. This focusing ring still moves freely. The back variable obviously moves freely. Everything looks good. Now you can go ahead and snug everything down. I tighten these up with this into the Allen wrench first, just to get everything so it's bottomed out. Where it's supposed to be. And then I go back and I just make sure everything's tight. So there should be 4 bolts in the front up here. 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then there's 4 in the bottom. Just make sure you get everything tight. And this should be your assembly. Should look just like this. Like I said, equal clearance around the rings. The focusing ring moves freely, variable moves freely. You're about as parallel as you can make it to that base. Now you're ready to build the other one. All right, now that you have both your scopes mounted on your upper bases, you're ready to mount the scopes to the main base and the handle. To do that, there's 4 1/4-inch bolts, 4 washers. Turn the scope upside down, and we're just going to lay the main base over the top of the upper base, and then looking through these slots so you can see those threaded holes, just kind of hold it in place. Then what I do is I put a washer over the bolt and drop it into that slot and just start the bolt 1 or 2 turns. That's all you need. Do the same thing on the other one. Then just bottom it out, back it off again, maybe a half turn or so the whole thing can move. That's it. Flip it around and do the same thing on the opposite side. Expose those holes so you can see them, and then drop a bolt and a washer in the slot. And then bottom it out, back off a little bit. Then I stand them up on their objectives. You can see the entire thing can move, it's all loose still. And then all I do is just eyeball the line, in my case, right about the middle. And I just snug that up. Do the same thing with the right scope. So now both scopes are on the same line. Flip it over and do the same thing with the objectives. Now you can tighten it up if you want, but you're going to take these out and collimate them right now, so they do not need to be tight all the way. So these lines right here are reference. In the packet that you receive with your adapter, it'll have a little grid and it tells you the pupillary distance of each line. So you can use that as a reference to where you should start off with your scopes. But it's not the law. When you're out there collimating these, what your main objective is going to be to get these things so you can see through them and everything looks perfect. So if this one's in the middle line, but this one's 1 line to the right, it's not a big deal. It's just to get you started so everything is symmetrical from the start. And then after that, you guys can move them as need be. The last thing you're going to do is there's a series of 1/4-inch threaded holes right down the middle. That's where your tripod adapter goes. So whatever tripod you guys are running, it's going to have an adapter plate that goes with it, an ARCA compatible or something, or maybe it's proprietary, but it's going to be some sort of an adapter. This is the C-Ray, one that I use for the VA5X head. So it's got a 1/4-inch threaded screw, and you just lay it over the middle and tighten that down. Now these are ready to take out and collimate.